Hello everyone. Here I am once again. Howdy doody. There's not much actually to announce since I had actually taped the university's lecture yesterday, and so it's just the next day, and there's not a ton more that's happened in the world or in the smaller University of Virginia. Although I will say I just saw a report where in the state of Virginia, the Dominion of Virginia actually, there was a further 500 cases of the coronavirus over the last 24 hours, so it's beginning to spike up a bit in Virginia as it will begin to do in most places. Obviously, at this point, it's the major urban centers that are suffering the worst, as you all know, especially New York City. And what is likely to happen, although we hope it doesn't get to that degree elsewhere, places where it got a bit of a later start, the number of cases will begin to continue to rise, and that's kind of what's happening here now. We're going to talk about women in medieval England in a few minutes. As is ever the case with this, go to Blackboard, get the outline, get the study guide, and you'll see on the study guide that there are some separate questions, of course, for the documents on the Blackboard reader, and I'll probably set up a discussion board, not so much for the documents generally, but for the bit you're going to read from the Book of Margery Kempe, since you're going to take in about 75 pages of that, and it's actually fairly interesting reading. And as with the last section of the university ones, I'm going to split this into two parts, which seems a better way to do it. That way you can digest it in slightly smaller chunks. And this one is not as long as that one, and so it'll take a little bit less of your time to actually work your way through it. I'm filming this actually today. It's the 7th of April, Tuesday, and this should go live on Thursday, the 9th of April, the day that the class is scheduled to meet when this topic appears on the syllabus. I did decide actually that a change of scenery wouldn't be a bad thing, and so where you see me sitting now, you can probably guess that this is the garden in the rear of our house. If you guys had taken a look at the link I sent you for that editorial thing I did for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, the picture that my wife took of me was taken actually here, and this Japanese maple that we have, which is beginning to put its leaves out in a very lovely way, was the background for that. In the back we have some really rocking wisteria this year, but I don't think you can see it from here. Maybe before we end everything this semester, you'll get something like the full house and garden tour, and maybe I'll do a couple of these upstairs in the first floor. Probably not the second floor, because that's my wife's realm, and I don't think she would like me to encroach on it in this way. Although, yeah, maybe. We'll see. And she's saying, she heard that. She's eavesdropping on me, and she just bellowed that, no, the house isn't clean. Okay, whatever. Uh, anyway, so the topic for today is women in medieval England. And before we get into the substance of the thing, one quick note. We're now moving chronologically a step even further down the line. Today we enter the late Middle Ages, the period of from around 1300 to around 1500. And if you recall, during the High Middle Ages, you had this notion of the zenith of medieval civilization, where the theme is expansion, a type of progress, and most of the things that we associate in our mind as the peak of medieval society and culture, they appear during that period. The late Middle Ages have a entirely different tone, or as the Python boys would say, and now for something completely different. This period has sometimes been labeled the Age of Adversity, because what happens in Europe, Western Europe in particular, from around 1300 to around 1500, is a series of interlocking crises, things that go on that sort of bounce back and forth against each other in some respects. You have a series of demographic and economic crises. Great Famine, Black Death, we'll be talking about that actually as our next topic, and it's a topic that has some currency. It was actually part of the reason why I wrote that little opinion piece for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, to try to spike some of the sort of more hysterical comparisons of the coronavirus to the Black Death, and to give us, and just say to people, keep calm, be concerned, but do what you need to do. It's also a period of ecclesiastical and spiritual crisis, and unfortunately, because of the limits of time in the course, I don't really go into that deeply. If I ever teach, for any reason, my late medieval course, again at UR, it consumes about a third of the course in that course. And so you're getting a little shortchanged on that one. But there are also some significant problems in the church from a variety of perspectives that go on during this period. And you also have some fairly significant military and political crises. The one military political crisis that we'll talk about is the 100 Years' War, the topic with which we'll end the course, our very last topic. And so you see things taking a turn, that these crises are of sufficient gravity that you begin to see the fraying out of medieval institutions and some medieval ideas, and you begin to make the jump toward early modernity, a very different sort of society. It doesn't happen overnight, but over the course of time, that is what has been eventually produced. And that's when you begin to move out of the Middle Ages into a different space historically. Now, specifically about women, for any of you who have read Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, it was actually her very first novel and was not published, in fact, until after her death. She wrote it, she completed it, was ready for publication, but never came out until she left this mortal coil. There's a lament in this by its main character, Catherine Morland. She says that history deals only with male activities and that women barely appear in it, and she didn't like that. The Catherine Morland character is a very interesting character in that she's a very bookish sort of character, given to reading and thinking. And she's not wrong in the sense of any history that she would have read in her day. That would have been very largely the case. There have been efforts by legions of scholars, particularly over the past generation and a half, 2 generations of scholarship, to redress this imbalance. And it's here actually I'm going to mention a man named John Ball, who will be mentioned again in another context in your next topic. John Ball, at the beginning of one of his sort of sermons, he was actually a defrocked priest, said that when Adam delved and Eve span, and that we'll talk about the rest of the sentence later, but the point is, in the conception of John Ball, there were very much gender-based divisions, that he perceived Adam working in a different way than Eve worked, that Adam was the delver or the digger in the earth, the toiler outdoors, whereas Eve was at the spinning wheel in a domestic sphere. And so this is as good of encapsulation of the conception of different functions of men and women during the Middle Ages as you're going to find. There was a lot of truth in terms of this is how people perceive the order of things. Now, in terms, before we get to women specifically in the Middle Ages, and we're going to talk about them from more or less the perspective of the large groupings of women in specific environments, we should say actually a few words, more than a few words, about the notion of women's history. Women have been professional historians for generations. There were some great female medievalists during the 19th century, even. You can go a fair ways back. But the study of a history of women is a relatively recent development. It wasn't done that much, particularly in context of the Middle Ages. And this is something that's been shifting over time. And we should note that if you think about women in universities, the imbalance in terms of just participation in university life, it is in the process of being redressed. And if actually, you should take a look at the roster in the history department at UR, and you'll discover, I don't even know what the number is now since I haven't been over there for a few years, I don't keep track, but the last time I thought about it, there was almost a perfect balance between men and women in the department. And this also reflects the way graduate studies going now, where in some fields actually you have more women engaging in graduate studies than men. And so in terms of just participation in the academy, that's something that has changed drastically over the last couple of generations. You know, when I was first coming up, when I was actually in graduate school and doing my first sort of serious teaching, I won't name the department. I've taught it in a number of different places, so I don't want to say anything snide about anybody unnecessarily, but the first department where I did really, really significant teaching, it was an almost entirely male-dominated department. There were only 2 female faculty members in it, and it was also a very elderly department, so it was in the process of beginning that demographic shift. And that's something that's gone on in many university humanities departments, social science departments, science departments for that matter, over the last generation or so. And so I've seen sort of the tail end of the old order, and it begins to be replaced by a more basically gender balanced sort of situation. But in terms of uh, having something written about women during the Middle Ages by a reputable historian, for quite some time, the gold standard was a little book written by a woman named Eileen Power. Uh, this thing called Medieval Women. It's a book that I read as both as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, and she was a fabulous scholar. There's no question about that. She wrote about a lot of other stuff too. She did a lot of economic history actually, so I've read about her in different contexts. And I should note, at least one of you is addressing the Poston thesis. This thing that was produced by Michael Poston that deals with medieval demographics. And she and Poston were married. They were a married academic couple in sort of an Oxbridge environment. Well, anyway, Medieval Women was the book that everyone used for a very long time. If you wanted to assign something about women in your course, it was the standard thing that people would read, which is why I was exposed to it when I was an undergraduate. But since over the past 4 decades, 5 decades, the growth of the study of women's history has exploded from a medieval perspective and also generally across most fields. And when people engage in the practice of doing women's history, their goal largely is to question traditional periodization of history, since in the view of many of these scholars, it reflects a largely male patriarchal conception of history, that the periodization is done from the perspective of the concerns of men, and the other half of the population isn't much considered in terms of how you characterize these periods. And so what there's been an effort to do is to redress this, to begin to think about, well, does this periodization actually really work anywhere nearly as well when you view it from the perspective of the experience of women during these times? And so that's sort of how the process of beginning to reassess this history occurs. In this traditional model of history, the more patriarchal model, half of the population effectively gets lost or was lost and is in the process of recovery at this point. There's the desire to restore women to history, and there's been a fair amount of success in actually doing that, which is why I have information I can actually tell you, because people have been studying this assiduously and putting these results out for the world to read. One of the problems in historiography in prior generations is that for a long time it was asserted that women during the Middle Ages couldn't be studied because in a male-dominated society there was little evidence of their thoughts and of their activities that actually remained, that you simply couldn't do it for lack of evidence. And in regard to this, maybe a way to drive this point home is by a personal anecdote. I'm assuming at this point you've already listened to the university's lecture, and I talked a little bit in that lecture about my own experience of going through the examination process to get a PhD. And in it, I mentioned this thing called qualifying exams, where after you've done a couple of years of coursework and very wide reading in your field, then you are put up before a board of examiners, where they go at you for a number of hours to test how much you know, to test the limits of your knowledge, and in most instances to finally get you to the point where you admit you don't know certain things, which I think is one of the better aspects of the exercise, because it's not, I think, for you to demonstrate to everybody what you know, although that's part of it. It's also to drive home to the student who's becoming something other than a student, uh, the limits of your knowledge, that you're never going to know everything, obviously, and most good days there's not that much rattling around in my head. I think you probably already figured that out. And so anyway, when I was taking my qualifying exams, I had my 4 examiners, and they were 4 men, 2 medievalists, a Reformation scholar, who was examining me both on Renaissance and Reformation, because he did that as well to some degree, and somebody from classical antiquity. It was actually a Greek scholar, but he was examining me on both Rome and Greece, and he would teach both, did most of his research in Greece, actually. And then the university in these examinations, they always send in somebody from another department to observe and also to participate if they want to, although they're usually reluctant to because it's outside their field. But they're there to make certain that there's no monkey business going on, nothing weird, no corruption of any sort. And so in this instance, this woman was sent over, a teacher of rhetoric, and apparently pretty well known in her field. I didn't know her personally. She just shows up at the exam, which is what happens. You don't know these people before they arrive. And as is usually the case, she sat there very quietly, which happens in most instances because they're reluctant to participate, although they always can. And so she sat there for several hours listening to these five guys and me and the four examiners, basically, and I'll admit this freely because of our own individual interests, we were basically manly men doing manly history. In other words, in terms of our own personal interests, we weren't doing a lot with gender. And for my examiners, there wasn't much of an expectation that I would do that because it wasn't within their interests, and I was having to satisfy them in these exams. And so it's not something I'd spend a ton of time on. I touched upon it, obviously, in my reading and in my historiography classes, but it wasn't a central part of the discussion. And so this woman, she listens very politely and quietly through several hours of this as we're going back and forth on various topics. And then as we draw to the end, it's always good form to ask if the outside person has any questions. And she did, actually. And she asked a devastating question. She said, I've been listening to your discussion for the last several hours, and I find it interesting. I'm fascinated by it. I'm not critical about what you're talking about. But there's one question I sort of have. Did women actually exist during the Middle Ages? And that was directed to me, of course, since I'm the examinee. But the point was, I never got to answer it because everybody on my committee started answering the question. And they didn't give particularly good answers, but they gave sort of the standard answer that it's very difficult to do that. And so even this was an examination that was conducted, if memory serves, in the autumn of 1990. And so it tells you, even at that point, this was a concern. And it was a perfectly valid question. And so since my committee members were perfectly happy to deal with the question, I sat back very quietly and let them chat about this for a while. And then we ended the examination after that, and everything went fine. But it is a good way of driving this point home in terms of the way in more traditional historiography women have been largely left out of it. And there's been this process of redressing this. And obviously, it made the point very clearly with me that it's not within my interest, it's not within my research field to do that, but it's something that I think every medievals scholar needs to pay greater attention to, and I have subsequently done that over the last 30 years. Now, basically, women's history reject this supposition about history of women that you can't study it because there is not evidence. What they've done is they scoured old sources to discover what they reveal about women, to see if there is a little kernel of something in things that have been used before. And they've done reconnaissance for new sorts of sources heretofore not discovered, which would improve our understanding of women's experience. And they also develop new ways of reading sources that, can you use a different type of analysis where you can take an existing source and maybe tease a bit more information out of it. And this is where we get into gender analysis, which has become part and parcel of the toolbox to try to deal not just with women, but with other categories of understanding of people. And we should note what gender analysis is. In terms of, the word sex is the biological reality. It's the plumbing that people have. Gender is the complex of social, cultural, and legal norms that we tend to associate with people, which is not necessarily dependent, of course, upon the plumbing. And so there's been much more use of very developed gender analysis to try to tease more out of the sources. And obviously this applies not only to study of men and women, but it also deals with sexual preferences in terms of what's going on during the Middle Ages. Other perceptions of gender are coming into it increasingly. And so as you look into the constellation of medieval scholarship, you will find a lot of work being done on this. And it's vastly improved our understanding of the Middle Ages by having these sorts of analysis done and new evidence brought to bear on questions. And it also leads people who aren't necessarily even interested in these areas to reevaluate what they're seeing in their own sources and in their own work. And it's been all to the good as far as I'm concerned that this has been going on. We should note that there are some other conceptions that have come into play. There's a guy named Thomas Kuhn, who actually at this moment teaches down at Clemson, who believes actually, or he's developed a concept that he calls social personhood. And I know at least one of you is working on your paper on issues in reference to women. You might look at some of his work and this notion of social personhood. Basically, he thinks gender is too restrictive a tool because we tend to think in terms of modern gender categories, which can be somewhat anachronistic. And we tend to think in terms of autonomy when we think about assessments of women. Did they gain a type of autonomy? Did they gain a type of power? And what he notes is that one truth about this society is it's very difficult for women to be completely autonomous during the Middle Ages. And so as he thinks about it, what he does is he looks at the context in which women find themselves, their cultural milieu. He looks at the limits that are imposed upon them, and then he asks, how do women negotiate these limitations in order to assert themselves? They might not be able to become completely autonomous in a lot of contexts, but they can find ways to increase the space in which they operate. And that's where he thinks this concept of social personhood is of some value. And so you might take a look at some of his work. Now, in terms of this reevaluation of women during the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages / Renaissance, it's been the prime target for this reperiodization of history within the Middle Ages. We should note an issue in terms of periodization. When you're dealing with Europe north of the Alps, the period from 1300 to about 1500 is called the late Middle Ages. When you go south of the Alps down into Italy, it's more commonly considered the Renaissance. And so you have these two things going on at once because there are different things going on to some degree in different parts of Europe during this period. So I don't want to get you confused by this. When I use this term, I'm talking about the same period roughly. The Renaissance extends beyond 1500 clearly, and it eventually has a northern manifestation of it. So Northern Europe becomes Renaissance, but it becomes Renaissance a little later in a slightly different way, in sort of a Christian humanistic way. If you take an early modern course, this is something that you would talk about, or a Renaissance course, you would talk about this in great depth. But we're dealing with the earlier part of it here, the 1300 to 1500 part. The Renaissance, when you think about it, and I think we actually at one point maybe even alluded to this early in the semester when we were talking about what the Middle Ages mean. The Renaissance, it's associated with this notion of classical revival, bringing back Greece and Rome. It's also associated with notions of individualism, assertion of the individual as opposed to sublimation of an individual to a community, which is more of a medieval way of thinking about things. And it's also associated with notions of intellectual liberation, to be able to go out and think freely and to put these ideas out for general broad consumption, not just in an ecclesiastical environment, but in the large, broader secular world. There are overtones within the idea of Renaissance of progress and improvement of society, and progress and improvement of the individual. And this leads to an interesting question. Do these categories apply when you're talking about women? Well, there is the question. Does the notion of a Renaissance have any meaning at all for women when you view the world from their perspective, from the way they lived during these periods? Did women have a Renaissance is the most simplest formulation of the question. And actually there was a scholar, a woman named Joan Kelly Goodall, passed away in 82. She produced an article in 1977 in a journal, and the name of the article is, Did Women Have a Renaissance? She asked the question in the most blunt, direct way, and at the time, it would be considered a very provocative question to ask. Kelly suggested that the economic and political developments that molded Italy into a quote-unquote more modern pattern made possible and these developments had also made possible the social and cultural expression of the Renaissance had a negative impact on women. In other words, that what worked well for men in society, where you see all of these values of progress, individualism, intellectual freedom, that kind of thing, they had the reverse effect on women for the most part. And so from her perspective, no, women did not have a Renaissance. They had a very different experience. And so from her point of view, you need to rethink the notion of the period, what it actually means, that there needs to be a fundamental revision as far as Joan Kelly was concerned. She asserts that there is a link between the experience of men and the experience of women during this period, that these developments that created opportunities for men narrowed the opportunities for women in terms of their own self-expression and involvement in the larger society. And so she's very, very definitive about this in the way she expresses this in her article. This article inspired a flood of scholarship, and it's one of those instances where you have a single journal article appear and it changes the landscape. And this is a rare thing, because I will tell you, and you should already know this, there are a lot of journal articles that come out, and because it's part of people's professional requirement to advance in their field to publish this stuff. And yeah, well, I think the world could be just as well off without a significant chunk of them. But then you have an article like this that is kind of a game changer. Uh, some scholarship confirms her view. That some scholars have concluded that they think she's largely right in her portrayal of this. Other scholarship revises it a bit, saying she's mostly right in substance. There are some areas on the edges that we might, moderate some of her assertions. Other scholars have rejected elements of it, but it's never been rejected in a wholesale way. It's been revised. It's gone through this sort of conversation that scholarship goes through. And that's the process by which we come to a better understanding, by somebody putting an idea out and then people responding to it, critiquing it. And that's what's happened with her. In any event, however you cut it, this was a scholarly watershed, the appearance of this article back in '77. It's an article that more than 40 years later continues to be cited frequently, even if only as a straw man in some instances. It pops up in virtually any consideration of women during the Renaissance, and it pops up in a lot of medieval scholarship as well. And her argument, has led scholars to question long-held assumptions about women for other periods of European history. For instance, was the high medieval period, in fact, a high period for women? Well, that's a question to ask, actually. It's a little harder to get at for the earlier parts of the High Middle Ages, but it is something that scholars are actually assiduously working on. Now, this leads us to another question. It's sort of the broad framework of why women are dealt with the way they are during the Middle Ages, the conception of women in the Middle Ages. It's a very misogynistic conception. There's no other way to put it. You move into the literature, into the evidence for the period, and there's a lot of overt misogyny. There's some that's more subtle, but it's a common thing that runs through a great deal of it. This medieval society was patriarchal and frequently very openly misogynistic. And the question then is, why was that the case? So I'm going to get at this by talking about the conception of women during the medieval period and the appearance and development of misogynistic literature during the Middle Ages. As with anything medieval, when you're talking about a large cultural phenomenon, you'll want to go back to the classical period, because the classical period obviously is one of the key elements that influences the Middle Ages. So you look at the classical tradition, you try to assess its impact upon later misogynistic literature. You have, first of all, Greco-Roman philosophy, both Greek philosophy and Roman philosophy. There are differences in them, but there is a common thread that runs through them in this respect. That in a lot of these philosophical systems, you will see male associated with soul. In other words, male associated with intellect, with reason, with what they would consider higher functions, more disembodied abstract functions. You will see female being made analogous to body or matter. And so there's immediately an assumption within this type of philosophical assumption of feminine inferiority. And so that's just sort of out there. Some of these philosophical systems are they formulate it in a slightly different way. They'll assert that woman is an imperfect or defective man. And again, there is this hierarchical sense to it. And so when you look at these philosophical traditions as they bleed into medieval conceptions, that's already there. Beyond that, you have the influence of the Judeo-Christian tradition and how it sets up a particular conception of women. The most common images of women, the most universal ones from a Judeo-Christian perspective, you have the Eve image and you have the Mary image. The Eve image, and I assume all of you are familiar with it, it emphasizes the inherent weakness and sinfulness of women. It's the notion of Eve and the fall, the Eve eating from the apple of knowledge of good and evil, and eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then giving it to Adam, who then eats as well. And, the temptation of Eve by the serpent, the story in Genesis. Now, I would note that if you go back to Genesis and read it pretty carefully, which I don't think a lot of people actually do, this conception of Eve from the story is you might characterize it as either a misreading or a very limited reading of the Genesis account. And I would urge you, if you're curious about this, go back and take a look at it and read it very carefully and think about it a bit. Uh, but whatever the case, whether it's a misreading or a limited reading, it creates this particular image. And what happens with Eve is she is basically labeled as the creator of a burden borne by all later women. And it feeds into this notion that women are fundamentally flawed. So the image is used in this perspective within Judeo-Christian tradition, and it's certainly used this way during the Middle Ages. The suggestion is that Eve is actually controlled more by her body. She's more impulsive than she is controlled by her mind. This makes it to some degree similar to these classical ideas that we talked about. There's quite a bit of overlap there in the conception of the differences between men and women. There is, as a result of this, a large body of literature that portrays women as idle, as spendthrift, as susceptible to temptation, as endowed with poor judgment, as being gossipy, wayward, and wanton. And these are just common staple themes in portrayals of women in literature of the Middle Ages. And the Eve image is much of what fuels this idea. We should note, however, it's not just this Hebrew Bible Old Testament Eve image that feeds into this. The Christian tradition itself contributes to this idea of women. If you take Paul, the great missionary and writer of letters, his letters represent a significant chunk of the Christian New Testament, he insisted on the inequality of women in both the public and the private spheres. Now, there is a little bit of ambiguity in that he sometimes uses marriage and images of men and women together in very positive ways. He draws this analogy, Christ as the bridegroom of the church and that sort of thing. But in terms of his sort of social preaching, there's this clear sense that women have a particular limited place within both public and private life. And so that feeds into these conceptions as well, that the man is supposed to be the head of the family. The woman was supposed to be an obedient subordinate to the husband in a family sort of arrangement. And so this was considered the ideal for Paul, and it helps to further cement these images of women within medieval society. Now, the Mary image mitigates the Eve image to a degree. It's a very positive image of women, but women are never allowed to be free from the stain of Eve, even when you have the Mary image as a different image of women. Mary is often presented as a figure who transcended feminine imperfections, which doesn't reject the notion of feminine imperfections. This that she manages to transcend them. Even with this mitigating image of Mary, there was a flood of misogynistic literature by the 12th century. If you wanted to read things that are very misogynistic, very openly woman-hating, you can find plenty of it. Sometimes you'll see actually, there's a great example from Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales where he kind of subverts this idea a little bit. Some of you may have read The Wife of Bath's prologue to The Wife of Bath's Tale. In this, the wife of Bath, who's a fascinating character, at age 40, she takes a fifth husband. And so she's, had 4 husbands prior to this. The fifth husband is a 20-year-old Oxford dropout, one of these college ne'er-do-wells, the type. Anyway, once they're married, obviously they have this kind of hot May-September romance thing going on. Once they're married, he's an educated, literate man, so he begins on a nightly basis to read to her from a book composed of excerpts on the deeds of wicked wives from Eve onward. And he does this every night. He reads to her out of this book. She gets increasingly angry at him. Eventually, there is a knockdown, drag-out fight between the two. It comes to actual physical blows. And an interesting thing happens. After this, according to the wife of Bath, the husband submits to her authority and they live happily ever after. And so you have the subversion of the image, where it's the husband, the younger husband, who's the subordinate, and the wife who is the superior in the relationship. But nonetheless, what this demonstrates is the common access to this misogynistic literature. Chaucer wasn't making this up. This stuff was out there. And so when you see this literature, within it, either the misogyny is open or there's a tacit assumption of female inferiority within this literature. It's just what it is. We should note in this regard that much of the literate population was composed of celibate males, talking about monks and priests here, whose direct actual personal knowledge and experience of women should have been, in theory, very limited. In other words, the people who are writing about women may have been the segment of society who, in terms of their personal experience, had the least experience with women. Obviously, they would have had families prior to entering their vocations, but once they do that, once they become either a priest or a monk, particularly with a monk, and I'm talking mostly about monks here, uh, their understanding of women should have been theoretically fairly narrow. Uh, and when you look at some of the writing these guys do, and monks are particularly guilty of this, uh, their attitudes are kind of adolescent whenever the subject of women come up. They will do things like trade quote unquote women jokes, which would be roughly analogous to modern ethnic jokes. And so it descended down to that level where when you read this stuff, you're thinking, I'm listening to an 11 or 12-year-old write this, and you wouldn't be far off the mark, actually, in terms of the attitudes they've developed. Um, beyond this, if you think about the society more largely, this applies to the literature, but it also applies to most social interaction that you see in a written form. There's a tendency to deal with women exclusively in terms of their relationships with men. Women are dealt with as a wife or a mother or a daughter or a sister. That the defining point is always the male within the relationship, not the woman herself. Now, this literature does not always necessarily reflect a conscious attempt to oppress women, but it does reflect an inability to see women in any but an inferior role. And so this is the common thread that runs through all of it. And this is a reflection of the prevailing attitude within society. This stuff comes from somewhere, obviously, in terms of a broader social context. Now, there's also another issue that we need to deal with as a preliminary, and it has to do with literacy and sources. Latin literacy among women was rare. Now, literacy during the Middle Ages itself is relatively rare. And so, but if you think about Latin literacy, there are very few Latin sources written by women about women. This is quite unusual. There are exceptions to this, but it's pretty rare. Women, however, when they were literate, they were frequently literate in vernacular languages as they developed: English, French, Spanish, Italian. And what you see is a slow movement from Latin to vernacular in public records as you move further into the later medieval period. Prior to that, almost everything that was public record was written in Latin, but you begin to see more vernacular writing over the course of time. And since women have vernacular literacy, they can begin to maybe produce things in the vernacular a little more easily. But even with this, nearly all information that you have about women appears through the filter of male attitudes and prejudices. And so you do have an issue there. You always have to factor that. And it's the same thing with the peasantry, as we'll have talked about, that when you're dealing with peasants, they're rarely speaking in their own voice. It's frequently going through this filter, and you have to factor that filter in when you see opinions expressed about them. And so it's something to always bear in mind. And there's another problem with public records. Women tend to appear less frequently because, with only a few exceptions, women were considered perpetual legal minors. They were not legally independent. When a woman married, she immediately was placed under something called coverture, the coverture of her husband. It's the husband who's the public-facing figure within the couple and not the woman. And what happens in many cases is that when a woman marries, she will vanish practically from public records. If she's later widowed, then she frequently reappears, and she will appear prior to her marriage. But you have this period of time, if she's married, you're going to see her popping up in public records much less frequently. And so opens up an interesting question. If the course had continued on campus and everybody had their copy of Judith Bennett's A Medieval Life, which deals with this woman named Cecilia Pennifatter, a peasant woman, you might ask, how was it that Judith Bennett, in her own mind, could conceive of the possibility of writing a biography of a peasant woman when women tend to disappear from public records. And so I'll sort of leave that to you. And I will encourage you, don't sell the damn book immediately. I don't know, how far you guys have progressed with free claiming your belongings, whether the letting back on campus thing. That's above my pay grade to worry about. But before you get rid of the thing, start reading it a little bit. I think you might actually enjoy it. It's a fascinating piece because it just doesn't deal with Cecilia Pennefatter. She offers a very broad background, Judith Bennett does, of the later medieval period in it. And that's part of the reason why I signed it. It's useful just beyond women. I signed it for the women topic because it's dealing with a specific woman in a specific circumstance, and she was able to ferret out quite a bit about her. Whether it rises to the level of what we would recognize as a biography is, I think, kind of an open question, but it's certainly a useful book. And so how was it that she was able to do that? Well, anyway, it's this problem that's at the roots of this claim that's been somewhat debunked, that women cannot be studied. And were these problems insurmountable? Well, obviously not. And I will say, in terms of evidence, there is a chronological dividing line. And that's roughly for England, and applies, I think, to the continent somewhat as well, around the year 1200. That from 1200 onward, you have more evidence, quite a bit more evidence about the mass of women. That prior to this, it's harder. But after 1200, you know quite a bit more. And when you think about, earlier medieval women, you tend to know about women who are elite women. And, obviously we know a ton about Eleanor of Aquitaine, and we later know a ton about figures like Joan of Arc. But these are exceptional women in exceptional circumstances. And what you really want to find out is how most women live, the majority of women, what their experience was. It's tougher to do before 1200. After 1200, you have quite a bit more evidence, and you can begin to fill the picture in more successfully after that date. And so the period that we're talking about here, the late medieval period, 1300 to 1500, by that point, women are becoming much more into view, and you can say quite a bit more. And so most of our consideration of women is going to deal largely with that later period. That's why I place it with the late medieval topic, because you simply know more then. You're able to do more. And I should also note there's an interesting demographic issue here, which also becomes an evidentiary issue. You might be surprised to know that when you think about secular society, the larger society beyond the church, that women generally outnumbered men during the medieval period, and particularly during the late Middle Ages. There's several reasons for this, particularly from 1300 and certainly from 1350 onward. Men tended to die at higher rates during the Black Death, during the plague, than women did for whatever reason. There was a clear slight difference in mortality there. Men also had a greater habit of getting themselves killed in war and civic strife and in local disturbances than women did, because women are smarter than men, actually, as far as that goes. And also, when you think about the church, there were no female priests, during this period, so many men would be taken from secular society to enter the priesthood. And when you think about monastic orders, there were many, many more monks than there were nuns. And so you see lots of men leaving secular life and going into the church and not being part of that. And so when you think about lay people, there are actually more women in lay society than there are men. And this is in spite of the specific risks that women assume, because women tend to have very particular health problems, and there's a high rate of mortality from childbirth during this period, but that's more than overbalanced by these other factors. And so you have more women out there. And I can actually give you some urban figures to illustrate that. They're a little late, but they're very useful. If you take the city of Frankfurt in Germany in 1383, where they did a survey, a fairly detailed one in the city, what they discovered is that for every 1,000 men, there were 1,100 women. In other words, 100 more women for every 1,000 men in that society. Even more extreme example is the city of Basel in 1454, near the end of her period, where for every 1,000 men, you had 1,246 women, which meant that there were more women than men in society. And in England, as elsewhere, it was rare for a woman to be in her birth home after age 12. The expectation is that by that point she would be leaving in one way or another. Most women aspired to marriage, but when you have this gender imbalance in secular society, these conditions ensured that many women could never marry. And if they can't marry, but they're leaving the birth household, they need to find an occupation of some sort. And it's these women who are on their own, who don't marry, maybe by choice, perhaps by an inability to contract a marriage, that we begin to learn a bit more about women in the Middle Ages because they're out on a job. And when you engage in a sort of public activity, some sort of occupation, at that point you begin to impinge more on the public records. And this provides an avenue to learn more about women. And actually, uh, because of this, the massive medieval English women are perhaps best known through their work, and so you sort of take a social and economic approach, but a more economic approach, to try to uncover the experience of many women. And by this point, actually, we've already had the town and country discussion, and I hope you managed to hack your way through some of the town and country documents. The reason why I mentioned this in this context is you had actually a couple or three manorial court rolls, public legal documents produced by the manor, in your reading packet. And what you should have been able to do with these is to see allusions to women, where they're actually appearing in the public record. And I think actually in the study guide I asked you, well, in what capacities do they appear in these records? It's through the appearances at various stages of life and in various contexts that we can begin to piece together the lives of women, particularly peasant women, because when you think about this agrarian society, the vast majority of women were in the countryside in a peasant environment. And so when you're thinking about women generally, if you want to know about the biggest number of women, this is where you would go. It doesn't mean that you don't talk about women in the bourgeoisie, because we certainly will, and you look at noble women as well, because you know about them because they're noble women, obviously. They're more prominent within society. But you can get at the larger mass of women by delving into these records at this point, because they begin to appear in various specific contexts. And having said that, I think this is a very good place to break off the first half of this, because I am going to need a refill in my, this is the coolest mug ever. What do you think about this? Is that a cat mug or is that a cat mug? I need a refill of tea, I need a bite of lunch, and I need to upload the first half. And so I'm going to go inside on this very pleasant day and feed and water myself, and then I'll be back to give you the second half, the specific experiences of women, when we do the second half of the topic. So we'll talk to you in a bit. Bye-bye.